Let's surgically dissect this matter, starting with my strong points, which emanate from the works of Dr. Sheikh Anta Diop and Ladipo Solanke, who, in his book, United West Africa at the Bar of Family of Nations, mentions that far before Alexander the Great, before the Romans, before Athens was Ethiopia, the conqueror of Egypt. Egypt was such a great civilization and a great force to be reckoned with because of the Nile River. The desertification of North Africa forced settlements along the Nile, which provide fertile soil for farming, forcing the people to build a civilization along the Nile. Dr. Sheikh believed that these settlements had to be diverse, consistent of members from the West, East, and North Africa, with one aim of survival, with the majority influence coming from East Africa. An interesting point about the Egyptian civilization is that their pharaohs were not all from the same family, neither were they from the same ethnic group. Egypt was very diverse, and this diversity was reflected upon those who ruled them and their pharaohs. The elites in the Egyptian society, as well as their pharaohs, were as diverse as their entire population at the time. So there was no ruling class that consisted of just one ethnicity. We know of notable rulers from Libya and also from further south as Sudan. Let us look at the first pharaoh of Egypt, King Namon, the king who united Egypt. And you can see that he clearly has keen resemblance to one of modern-day Central and West Africa. After King Namar came King Zoser, who built the first pyramid, but unfortunately, we don't have the most accurate representation of his appearance because every representation that we do have of him, his nose is vandalized, his statue is defaced. We see that these vandalisms is very consistent amongst notable pharaohs in Egyptian societies, known for notable things like King Ramesses III, who's known for his construction of the temple at Karnak. I cannot say with a full heart that this vandalism was with racial intentions because I honestly don't know. But what I do know is that the evidence is damning, and many of these Egyptian relics have withstood the test of time of over 5,000 years, except their nose. Stop. You don't get it. In the year 1 AD when Jesus was born. This year is closer to us than it is when the pyramids were being built. So they had been around for a very, very long time, just for their nose to be weathered. The opposing theory that many scholars hold in regards to this is that since their nose sticks out more, it is more subject to agents of denudation. Therefore, their nose is weathered easily. Maybe the Egyptians used less quality materials when they were working on the noses of their statues. Others believe that various dynasties were at conflict with one another, so the Egyptians themselves vandalized the noses of their own relics so as to prevent their rivaling pharaohs from breathing in the afterlife. My posing question is, why not destroy the entire statue or remove the head completely? Why only tamper with its nose? And why has every other part of these statues withstood the test of time, except their nose? So, what happened in ancient Egypt to constitute the diversity that we see today? Even till this day, modern Egypt still has close resemblance to Ethiopia. And to understand its diversity more, there's something important that I must state first. Race is a modern day construct and was given no regards to in the past, so we must tread cautiously when we're associating a modern idea to a people who lived 3,000 years before Jesus Christ. These people gave no regards at all to race. In the region of modern day Egypt, there have always been people of lighter skin complexions and straighter hair since 60,000 years ago. And there's an argument that these physical features originated in Africa, because within Africa, you'll find every genetic diversity that is out there. Let's get even more complicated. Skin color doesn't necessarily give you a precise representation of someone's ancestry. For example, you can find people who are fair in complexion but have closer ancestral ties to someone that we may refer to as black, and to the contrary of that, you may find someone of a darker hue but have closer ancestral ties to someone that we may refer to as white. A good example of this is Uncle Ruckus. No relations. Another factor that may have contributed to the complexion that we see today in modern day Egypt is ancient Egyptian culture. We must understand the culture at the time. Egypt was a culture that focused on everything except military. Everyone who wanted a piece of Egypt got a piece of Egypt. From the Hyksos, the Assyrians, the Persians, Arabs, Libyans, the Nubians. This was the most unpredictable military in human history. I bet I could have gotten a piece of Egypt if I wanted to. You see, Egypt never really had a military, which is why it took them 150 years to free themselves from the Hyksos. This was their first military campaign conducted, and was only done so to liberate themselves from the Hyksos. And if I may, I'd like to spiral into a brief timeline of Egypt. 800 years before Jesus Christ came the invasion of my favorite people ever, the Kushites from Sudan, who occupied Egypt for nearly a century. Pause. If you guys don't know home team history, stop watching this video. In fact, I do not say this jokingly, and I mean this with all sincerity. Unsubscribe from my YouTube channel and subscribe to Home Team History and watch this video titled History of Nubia's Greatest Kings. You see, Kush was an older kingdom compared to Egypt and was located south of Egypt. Kush was more like an older brother to Egypt. They both had similar cultures and religion. They traded frequently amongst one another, and at the time, Egypt was under the rule of external forces, and the Kushite king Kashta took it upon himself to liberate Egypt. This was a holy war to restore and rebuild their religious traditions and temple, and to do away with the Libyans who at the time occupied Egypt, corrupting their religious identities. And after the Kushites came Alexander the Great, the Romans, and the Arab conquest. Everyone basically ran through Egypt. You can imagine the mix and the blending of so many cultures in one place, and this begs the question, is Egypt African? Well, hell yeah. The foundations of Egyptian society is a mix of all the continents of Africa, with a majority influence from Ethiopia. Hold on. Majority of the accounts that we have of ancient Egyptian societies are from the Greeks, because through Greek and the Rosetta Stone we're able to interpret hieroglyphics. The geographical location that the Greeks referred to as Ethiopia was not just modern-day Ethiopia as we know. This location referred to as Ethiopia consisted of Sudan, South Sudan, Ethiopia itself, Eritrea, and Somalia, kinda. Can you now see that this is all parallel to Ethiopia's claim that Egypt is but a colony of Ethiopia? Hold on. Please permit me once more to spiral into a temporary tangent. As an Afrocentrist, I innately gravitate away from talking about ancient Egypt because it makes it seem as though I'm grasping for straws, desperate to claim someone else's culture. This innate feeling is nurtured by the reality that there is a population of Egypt with little resemblance to the skin complexion shared by majority of the African continent. This has created within me, and I presume within many others as well, a conflict of interest that this civilization of Egypt has always been annexed to Europe or the Middle East. It is disingenuous and an injustice to exclude Egypt from Africa or African history. There's nothing foreign about Egypt. Egypt holds its foundations on the unification of several African societies along the Nile, foundations that began purely African during the construction of the pyramids. There's very little more African than that. Excluding Egypt from Africa is an injustice.
So let me be 100% crystal clear here. Did the entirety of the population of Egypt, or the majority of the population of Egypt, look like this handsome man? No. The ancient Egyptians were a multi-ethnic African civilization. It was multi-ethnic because of its very geographical position, a connection between Africa, the Mediterranean basin, and Asia, a strategic location on the crossroads of continents. The Egyptian civilization flourished around the Nile River, which was a cultural conduit of civilization. There is diversity in the skin of the Egyptians. Through time and space, the ethnic percentages will differ depending on what area of Egypt and which era. Egypt is not disconnected from the rest of Africa, and it is absolutely imperative to fully appreciate the complexity and connectivity of such a geographical area. However, the ancient Egyptians did acknowledge and recognize the physical differences between them and their neighbors, specifically utilizing skin tone as one of the major distinguishing factors. Already disproving this idea pushed by some people that the ancient Egyptians didn't even see a difference in skin tone, and that that's only something that we modern people see. Probably humankind has been noticing that difference since prehistorical period. Of course, the ancients didn't share the same beliefs and classifications as 19th century, 20th century, and 21st century people when it comes to the words that we use to identify people and how we use them. Even in my case, I have recently immigrated into the United States of America, and when I was filling in my immigration sheets, they asked me to put the ethnicity section, and when I asked, so what should I put, they said, just put white. Well, if this was the 1920s in the same United States of America, they would have been right either Italian as a separate ethnicity or, as it did happen, black, depending on, I suppose, on your skin tone, maybe, I don't know. These classifications are indeed fluid, but I think we all know what we mean when we say black. Like this guy. Here is what the Egyptians said. Look at this image. To the right, you see how the Egyptians represented themselves. The black gentleman is representing a Nubian, basically a member of the very prominent and very powerful and advanced kingdom of Kush, which was south of Egypt, and those are representations of an Asiatic and a Libyan. Of course, it's important to take into consideration the cultural and commercial and religious exchanges that happened between the kingdom of Kush and Egypt. Of course, a certain percentage of Nubians, which will differ depending on which area of Egypt we are talking about, will have lived among the Egyptians. But the Egyptians do represent themselves with this image, with this specific color. And with color and art, we enter a whole new range of topics that I'd like to hopefully simplify for this video. How did the Egyptians use and create color, and why do Egyptian women almost always look lighter in skin than their men? And was there any inner and sometimes hidden meaning within color itself? Well, each color was created by mixing various naturally occurring elements, and each became standardized in time in order to ensure a uniformity in artwork. An Egyptian male was always depicted with a reddish-brown skin, which was achieved by mixing a certain amount of standard red paint with standard brown. Experts say that this color was chosen because it was a realistic representation of the average Egyptian. Women's skin instead was most of the time represented with a mixture of yellow and white, and the reason of the explanation to this is because women tended to work the field a lot less than men. They tended to stay inside, and therefore their skin was lighter. If the difference in skin tone between men and women is darker or lighter depending on how much time they spend outside, then it suggests that even the darker tones we see are mostly a tan rather than the actual natural color that all Egyptians would have. So it is possible that a light brown would be a good representation when it comes to what the ancient Egyptian skin looked like. If they were all black in the sense of a Nubian, they would not represent the Nubians and themselves differently in art, and of course a Nubian's skin color is gonna be black, whether he stays inside or outside. The gods are represented with many colors, but they are symbolic when it comes to their skin. They can have a red skin, which usually has to do with aggression and evil in a way, although it can also symbolize life. Some gods have a blue skin, which represents protection and wisdom. Other gods have a green skin, such as oftentimes Osiris, because it's a connection to the afterlife. And when it comes to black skin in Egyptian art, even though it does have a connection to death, which is why we sometimes see gods such as Anubis having black skin, it was not connected to evil. Red was. So what about the term Kemet? Well, Kemet has been used again by some people trying to push this idea that all Egyptians were black and it was a black civilization, because they say that it means the land of the black, and therefore if the Egyptians refer to their own land as this is the land of the black, then it means that they consider themselves black. But it's interesting that the people that I've read in forums, they say this, but then a minute before that, they actually say, oh, but the Egyptians did never refer to themselves or other people as black and white and brown. That's a modern construct. And this already shows you lack of intellectual honesty, because you can't say that the Egyptian didn't use black, brown and white to describe people, and then a minute afterwards use it when it comes to the translation of the word Kemet when it's convenient to you. Kemet meant black land, meaning that was the color of the land, the soil. Scholars generally believe that this name derived from the fertile soil that was left over when the Nile flood receded in August. Considering the fact that the very people that pushed this idea of all the ancient Egyptians were black did say on multiple occasions that the Egyptians did not use color as a word to describe people, then I would say on their own terms that it is more probable that Kemet referred to the land being black, not the people. But when it comes to the analysis of DNA, there are several methods the scientists can use, including the direct PCR, a method of DNA amplification directly from an animal or plant tissue sample without performing DNA isolation and purification steps. This technique greatly reduces experimental time and cost in genotyping and high-volume projects, but it does come with issues surrounding the authentication of the retrieved DNA and the potential contaminations inherent to this method. Say the hot Egyptian climate, the high humidity levels in many tombs, and some of the chemicals used in mummification techniques, in particular sodium carbonate. All of these contribute to DNA degradation and are thought to render the long-term preservation of the DNA of mummies improbable. Now, some of you might ask, why bother with ancient mummies at all? Why don't you just check and analyze the DNA on modern day Egyptians? And the thing is that in order to do that, you would have to have a perfect genetic continuity over thousands of years, millennia. And that is very improbable considering the recent population admixtures from both other areas of Africa, Europe, considering Roman and Greek colonization, and the Islamic expansion. Even without genetic proof, it would be very unlikely to expect such a perfect continuity between ancient Egyptians and modern Egyptians, and this study in fact demonstrates so. Egypt was an African civilization, but it wasn't living in a vacuum. It was in a specific geolocation that connected the Middle East, Asia, Africa, and Southern Europe. And we do know, and we have Roman authors and Greek authors that tell us that there were areas and cities whereby the Greek settlements were so significant that up to 30% of the population was Greek, in towns that we would otherwise just call ancient Egyptian. And classical authors do tell us that after a few generations, the only way to really distinguish these people was to hear how they spoke and what language they used. So considering the data we have available right now, my opinion is that the Egyptians were a multi-ethnic population. The majority would have been brown, some would have been black, some might have been white. I'm more than happy to be proven wrong by new data. In fact, that is the very basis of this video that I would like, the message that I would like to leave with this video. This, in my opinion, is the most sensible position considering the data we have available. We always have to be open-minded. If by next year we analyze a huge amount of mummies and we see that instead the majority of Egyptians were black, I will be more than happy to say I was wrong. And I will be in fact fascinated by this discovery. But the same way, if we do find out instead that, again, a huge amount of mummies were analyzed and they once again show a genetic connection with Southern Europeans and people of the Levant, maybe we would even have to go back a notch and say maybe they were white. Right now, I don't believe so. I think they were olive and tanned for the majority, just like we see in the pictorial evidence, but keep an open mind.
Gati! 逃したか。